In the first days of April 1922, thick smoke rose steadily from the chimney of an isolated farm deep in the Bavarian woods, where the cattle were freshly fed and the fires kept burning against the freezing snow. But the family who owned that farm had not tended those fires, because all 6 of them had been brutally slaughtered in the dark 4 days earlier. The murderer had not fled into the night, but had simply stayed, living a quiet domestic life alongside their rotting corpses. By the 4th of April 1922, the uneasy feeling in the nearby village had hardened into genuine alarm. The Gruber family had missed Sunday Mass. Mail was piling up untouched at the local post office, and young Kazilia had not appeared at school for days. A search party of neighbors, led by a local mechanic named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, finally marched up the snow-packed road to see what was keeping the family. Hinterkaifeck was located only about 45 miles north of Munich. But in practice, it might as well have been at the edge of the world. To understand the profound isolation of the place, an American audience need only picture the lonely pioneer farmsteads of 19th century Iowa or Nebraska in the dead of winter. It was a sprawling, snow-choked nowhere, hemmed in by dark timberlines. It was the sort of environment where the nearest neighbor was a mile away, where the wind easily drowned out the noises of a struggle, and where a human scream could simply vanish into the frozen air without ever reaching another living soul. When the men arrived at the property, they were met with a heavy, suffocating silence. The doors to the main house were locked tight. Moving around to the back of the property, they forced their way into the machine shed and stepped into the adjoining barn. Their lanterns cut through the gloom, casting long shadows across the walls. In a dark corner, partially concealed under heavy wooden boards and a thick mound of loose hay, they found the reason the farm had gone so terribly quiet. 4 bodies had been dragged into the shadows and stacked one atop another like cordwood. There lay Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old patriarch, and his 72-year-old wife, Kazilia. Beneath them were their widowed daughter, 35-year-old Victoria, and her 7-year-old daughter, little Kazilia. They had been lured into the barn, one by one, and bludgeoned with such calculated ferocity that the scene defied the simple understanding of the rural farmers who stood over them. Blood had soaked deep into the straw, and the sheer brutality of the violence froze the search party in horror. But the farm was not yet done yielding its dead. The men left the barn and pressed into the farmhouse itself, breaking through doors that had been meticulously secured from the inside. In her bedroom, they found the maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner, murdered in her bed. Then, stepping into Victoria's bedroom, they looked down into a small bassinet. There lay 2-year-old Josef, struck down where he slept beneath his covers. The death of the maid carried its own bitterly cruel irony. Maria Baumgartner had just arrived at Hinterkaifeck to begin her employment on the afternoon of March 31st. She had walked through the snow to reach the isolated property, unpacked her modest bags, and gone to sleep for her very first night on the job, entirely unaware that she had walked into a slaughterhouse. Her life at the farm was measured not in months or weeks, but merely in a handful of hours. Yet, as detectives from Munich would soon descend upon the property to document the butchery, they would uncover a truth far more disturbing than the stacked bodies in the hay. The sudden violence of that Friday night was only a brutal conclusion. The real horror of Hinterkaifeck had quietly moved into the farm many months before the first blow was ever struck. To find the true beginning of the tragedy, you have to look back 6 months before the barn doors were forced open. In the autumn of 1921, the farm's previous maid abruptly packed her belongings and fled Hinterkaifeck in a state of absolute terror. She refused to stay another night, swearing to anyone who would listen that the isolated property was haunted. She had heard heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing across the attic floorboards long after the family had gone to sleep. At the time, her panic was dismissed as the superstitious rambling of a country girl spooked by the creaks and groans of an old timber house settling in the wind. She surrendered her wages, begged to be let go, and ran. But the farm was not haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by something made of flesh and bone. By the final weeks of March 1922, the unseen presence began to leave physical traces of itself. Andreas Gruber, a man who knew every inch of his property, started noticing small, impossible changes. Items in the machine shed had been shifted. A set of house keys vanished from their usual hook and could not be found anywhere. Then, a strange newspaper appeared on the kitchen table. It was a Munich publication, a paper the Grubers did not subscribe to, had not purchased, and could not have easily acquired. Someone had sat at their table, read the news, and left it behind for them to find. The creeping realization that a stranger had been moving freely through their private space began to poison the air in the farmhouse. The most terrifying discovery came just days before the slaughter. A fresh blanket of late-season snow had fallen over the Bavarian woods, turning the farm into a pristine white canvas. While walking the perimeter of his land, Andreas stopped dead in his tracks. There, pressed deeply into the fresh snow, was a single set of unfamiliar footprints. They emerged from the dark edge of the forest and marched in a straight, deliberate line directly toward the back door of the farmstead. Andreas followed the trail, expecting to see where the trespasser had wandered off. He found nothing of the sort. The tracks led straight into the farm, but there was not a single footprint leading back out into the woods. The meaning of those tracks was unmistakable. Whoever had walked out of the trees was still there. They were hiding somewhere within the sprawling complex of the property. The architecture of a traditional German farmstead meant the outbuildings, the animal pens, and the living quarters were all connected under one massive roof. A man could slip from the hayloft to the attic without ever stepping foot outside in the snow. A profound, suffocating paranoia descended upon the Gruber family. They were entirely isolated, miles from help, trapped in their own home with a phantom roommate who listened to their conversations, watched them work, and walked above their heads while they tried to sleep. The psychological torture of those final days is almost impossible to quantify. They were prey, waiting in the dark for a predator that had already breached the walls. Andreas Gruber was a stubborn man, and despite his growing terror, he made a choice that sealed his family's fate. He complained to his neighbors about the footsteps in the snow and the missing keys, but he refused to go to the authorities. He never called the police to search the property. It was a decision born of misplaced pride, and it would turn out to be the last fatal mistake of his life. The exact sequence of events that unfolded on Friday, March 31, was not pieced together by surviving witnesses, but by the grim and meticulous work of court physician Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller. When the Munich police eventually established a makeshift morgue in the farmhouse courtyard, the autopsies revealed a story of mechanical, almost industrial butchery. The murder weapon was identified as a mattock, a heavy agricultural hand tool featuring a stout wooden handle, a pick on one side, and an adze on the other. It was an instrument designed for breaking hard, frozen earth, and it had been swung with enough leverage to completely shatter human skulls. Yet, it was not merely the sheer violence of the blunt force trauma that unsettled the seasoned investigators. It was the chilling, calculating patience behind the execution. The killer, or perhaps a coordinated group of killers, did not kick in the front door of the farmhouse in a frenzied home invasion. Instead, they retreated into the freezing pitch-black confines of the barn and simply set a trap. At some point in the late evening, a deliberate noise was made in the machine shed, perhaps the restless shifting of the cattle, or the distinct clatter of a misplaced tool designed to draw the family out of the safety of their home. The forensic evidence clearly indicated that the Grubers did not go out to investigate as a group. They were lured into the dark, labyrinthine spaces of the outbuildings one by one. First came Andreas, stepping out into the cold to check on his property and his livestock, only to be struck down the moment he crossed the threshold into the shadows. Then came his wife, Cecilia, following her husband into the dark when he failed to return. She was met with the same heavy iron blade. She was followed by their widowed daughter, Victoria, And finally, 7-year-old little Kazelia. As each family member stepped away from the warm, lamplit farmhouse and into the freezing barn, the killer waited in the absolute blackness. The murderer stood over the bleeding remains of the previous victims, maintaining absolute silence, waiting for the next set of footsteps to approach. There were no defensive wounds on the older victims, no signs of a desperate chase through the snow, and no frantic barricading of doors. It was a blind ambush, executed with the cold, unfeeling precision of a slaughterhouse floor. Once the 4 bodies lay dead or dying, the murderer dragged them into a dark corner, stacked them unceremoniously atop one another, and covered them with hay to hide the massacre. The violence in the barn was complete, but the night was not yet over. Leaving the outbuildings, the killer walked across the quiet courtyard and entered the main house. Carrying the heavy mattock, now slick with the blood of 4 generations, the intruder moved silently through the narrow, creaking corridors of the farm. The house was completely still. In her small, modest bedroom, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner was deeply asleep. Having only arrived at Hinterkaifeck a few hours earlier, she had barely unpacked her belongings. The intruder brought the iron blade down upon her face, ending her life before she could even wake to register the nightmare standing over her bed. From there, the killer moved into Victoria's bedroom, approached the small bassinet where 2-year-old Josef slept peacefully beneath his heavy blankets, and delivered the same merciless judgment. Yet, the most heartbreaking and gruesome detail of that entire night lay hidden out in the freezing barn, buried beneath the blood-soaked straw. Dr. Aumüller's autopsy report revealed a truth so agonizing that it haunted the local police for decades. 7-year-old Kazelia had not died from the initial blow. The strike had fractured her skull and undoubtedly caused severe trauma, but it had not been immediately fatal. The little girl awoke in the freezing darkness, trapped beneath the heavy hay, lying directly beside the ruined bodies of her mother and her grandparents. The forensic evidence proved beyond any doubt that she survived for several hours in that unimaginable horror. In her final moments of shock, agony, and absolute terror, unable to call for help in the empty woods, the child had systematically torn out clumps of her own hair. A crime of this magnitude, driven by such overwhelming physical exertion and extreme violence, almost always ends in a frantic, adrenaline-fueled escape. A typical murderer would drop the heavy weapon, flee into the frozen tree line, and put as much distance as possible between themselves and the horrific slaughter they had just committed. But the killer at Hinterkaifeck had an entirely different plan. When a crime of such staggering magnitude is committed, the fundamental human instinct, even for the most hardened criminal, is immediate flight. The psychological weight of a massacre, combined with the overwhelming, copper-scented reality of the carnage, inevitably drives the guilty out into the dark. But the intruder at Hinterkaifeck did not run. After meticulously wiping the blood from the iron mattock, the murderer did not disappear into the freezing Bavarian woods. Instead, the killer simply settled in and made themselves at home. Over the next 3 to 4 days, the chimney of the main farmhouse continued to puff thick, steady columns of white smoke into the winter sky. Any neighbor passing by the distant tree line would have looked toward Hinterkaifeck and seen a picture of absolute, undisturbed rural tranquility. The fires were kept burning against the bitter cold, projecting a perfect illusion of safety to the outside world. But inside the walls, a surreal and terrifying domestic routine was unfolding. The killer walked into the Gruber's kitchen, sliced fresh meat from their pantry, and sat down to eat warm meals at the very same table where the strange Munich newspaper had appeared days before. When the cattle in the barn began to low from hunger and the need to be milked, the murderer did not ignore them. The killer calmly put on a coat, walked out to the freezing outbuildings, and stepped directly past the blood-soaked mound of hay, where 4 butchered bodies lay piled in the dark. There, mere feet from the rotting corpses of the family, the intruder dutifully fed the livestock and milked the cows, maintaining the daily chores of the farm with chilling composure. This level of calculated detachment pushes the crime far beyond the boundaries of mere anger, robbery, or revenge, placing it squarely into the realm of severe psychopathy. The killer did not just take the lives of the Gruber family, he effectively wore them. By maintaining the illusion of the farm, ensuring the animals were cared for, and the fires were stoked, the murderer bought invaluable time. The facade of normalcy was held up to deceive the distant neighbors, all while the heavy stench of death slowly filled the enclosed, interconnected structures of the property. The intruder became a parasitic ghost, a dark, calculating entity that had violently hollowed out a household only to take up residence within its shell. For nearly half a week, this phantom roommate slept in the beds of the dead, warmed themselves by their hearth, and lived off the provisions of a slaughtered family. The sheer proximity of the corpses, just a few yards away in the barn and in the adjoining bedrooms, seemed to bother the killer not at all. It was an act of supreme, arrogant control over a domain they had conquered through absolute violence. But a facade can only be maintained for so long before the creeping silence of a dead family becomes too loud for the outside world to ignore. When Lorenz Schlittenbauer and the search party finally shattered the locks and broke through the heavy wooden doors, on the 4th of April, the phantom had already slipped away. The killer had vanished back into the frozen woods without leaving a single trace behind, abandoning a blood-drenched puzzle that would frustrate the law, defy logic, and haunt the German nation for the next 100 years. When the Munich police finally arrived at the bloody farmstead, they were met with a crime scene that had already been hopelessly compromised. Dozens of curious villagers had wandered through the property, moving items, shifting the hay, and tracking fresh snow over the killer's footprints, unknowingly destroying whatever fragile forensic evidence might have been left behind. Inspector Georg Reingruber and his men were forced to build their investigation on a ruined foundation. They meticulously combed through the farmhouse, searching for a clear, logical motive. Robbery was the most common reason for rural violence, but it was quickly ruled out. Large sums of cash and gold coins were found in plain sight, completely untouched by the phantom intruder. The killer had not come for money. Over the following decades, the Bavarian police would interrogate more than 100 suspects, leaving the case file open well into the 1980s. Yet, every lead eventually dissolved into dead ends and village rumors. The most persistent of those rumors centered on the complicated web of relationships surrounding Victoria Gabriel. Her husband, Karl Gabriel, had reportedly been killed in the trenches of the First World War, an entire continent away from the snows of Bavaria. His body, however, had never been recovered. Whispered gossip in the local taverns suggested he had survived the war, returned to his homeland as a broken man, and crept back to the farm to take a brutal vengeance on his wife and her family. The theory was fueled by reports from returning soldiers claiming they had seen Karl alive, long after his supposed death, but the police could never find the man, alive or dead. Then there was the far more immediate suspect, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the local mechanic who had led the search party that fateful April morning. Schlittenbauer was a man deeply entangled in the dark, whispered secrets of the Gruber household. He had been Victoria's secret lover, and many in the village believed he was the true biological father of 2-year-old Josef. Some investigators wondered if his confident march to the farm and his immediate unearthing of the bodies in the barn was not the act of a concerned neighbor, but the calculated performance of a murderer staging his own discovery. His actions on the day the bodies were found were highly suspicious. He had unhesitatingly moved the corpses in the hay before the authorities arrived, contaminating the scene while claiming he was only searching for the young boy. He had a strong emotional motive. He knew the farm's exact layout, and he was present before the police arrived. Yet, despite heavy suspicion and intense questioning, the authorities could never gather enough hard evidence to formally charge him. The walls of Hinterkaifeck kept their secrets. As the years ground on, the Munich police grew increasingly desperate. The complete absence of physical evidence and the baffling psychology of the crime pushed the detectives beyond the boundaries of traditional law enforcement. In a bizarre and morbid attempt to break the case, the authorities ordered a drastic measure. The 6 victims were beheaded during the autopsy process. Their severed heads were meticulously packaged and sent to Munich, where they were handed over to a group of local clairvoyants. The police hoped that these psychics might somehow read the final, terrifying moments imprinted on the skulls of the dead. It was an act of absolute desperation by an overwhelmed justice system, and it yielded nothing but silence. The indignity suffered by the Gruber family and their maid did not end with those failed psychic experiments. The skulls were never returned to their bodies for a proper burial. Instead, they remained stored in a Munich justice building, kept as morbid evidence waiting for a breakthrough that would never arrive. 2 decades later, as the Second World War tore across Europe, Allied bombers leveled the city. In the fire and rubble of the bombings, the 6 skulls of the Hinterkaifeck victims were lost entirely, erased from history in a flash of military explosives. The official investigation formally spanned over 60 years, yet not a single conviction was ever handed down, and the true identity of the phantom roommate remains completely unknown. The law had utterly failed to provide an answer, leaving behind a cold case that would slowly pass from police records into the realm of local legend. In the year following the murders, the physical structure of Hinterkaifeck was systematically wiped from the face of the earth. By the end of 1923, the sprawling barns, the shadowed machine shed, and the cramped, suffocating farmhouse were entirely dismantled and leveled to the ground. The local community simply could not bear to look at the blood-soaked timber any longer, nor could they stomach the sight of the chimney that had once puffed smoke while a killer lived among the corpses. Today, nothing at all remains of the property where 6 people took their final terrified breaths. A lone, modest memorial shrine now stands in the middle of a quiet agricultural field, marking the exact spot where the farm once stood, offering a hollow, silent apology to the dead. The tragedy of the Gruber family was absolute, a nightmare that consumed 3 generations entirely and left no room for closure. They were slaughtered with an unfathomable, patient cruelty, and the legal system that was constructed to avenge them proved completely and utterly powerless. Even in death, the victims were denied the basic dignity of resting whole. Their bodies were lowered into the cold earth of the local cemetery, but their severed heads, having vanished into the fire and ruin of the Second World War, were never returned to the graves. The family was broken in the dark barn, broken in the sterile autopsy room, and left broken for eternity. The massacre at Hinterkaifeck endures as one of the darkest, most impenetrable mysteries of the 20th century. It is a grim testament to the vulnerability of absolute isolation, a story of a predator who weaponized the dead silence of the frozen woods to execute a flawless, terrifying crime. The killer managed to erase his identity so thoroughly that a century of relentless investigation could not pull his name from the shadows. And the most haunting detail of the entire ordeal remains exactly where the creeping terror first began. Just like those deep, heavy tracks pressed into the fresh Bavarian snow, in the final days of March 1922, a murderer stepped out of the dark tree line and walked directly into the world of the Gruber family. History never found the footprints of him walking back out.